I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad that there's a Revolutionary Student Union at Utah Valley University. Because, you know, there aren't very many Revolutionary Student Unions these days around the country. And I've traveled around enough to know that. It's interesting to hear the organizing part of your meeting, because I think that in many ways the most important thing is organization. And to have procedures and the way the decisions are made, that's also extremely important. The Party for Socialism and Liberation was formed in 2004. So next month, actually in June, it'll be the 6th anniversary. A lot of the people who formed it at the beginning were longtime members. The leadership were longtime members of Workers' Road Party. Most of us had been in, or several of us had been in the Workers' Road Party since the 1970s. And we left, and when we left, we didn't publish anything about it, because we felt that it was just going to be, we had tried to bring about changes in that organization, and that didn't happen, and we felt that it was better just to move on and keep organizing rather than get engulfed in what often happens between organizations. Workers' World had not had a split like this in its whole history, which went back to 1959. And we felt it would just turn into something that would be a waste of time, to tell you the truth, of, you know, kind of having a polemical battle with each other, and there was way too much else to do. We've had very significant growth over the last 6 years. And while most of the core people came from Workers' World, since then, people have joined who were formerly in the Communist Party in the United States, who were formerly in the Maoist movement, in the Socialist Workers' Party, and also people who were in parties in other countries, like from Iran and from Colombia, El Salvador, Mexico, and elsewhere, Peru. And so it's very interesting, because one of the things that we felt was that from the very beginning was that we needed to have a broader range of experience than just what we gained. And although we're proud of the history that we had in Workers' World, and we felt that the theoretical leader of Workers' World Party, a man named Sam Marcy, was an exceptional theoretical leader, but still that it was important to look at other organizations, how they were functioning, and so forth. Today we have branches. The size of the organization has increased by about 5 times since that beginning. And now we have, our largest branches are in New York City, in Washington, D.C., Chicago, and the two actually largest ones are in California, Los Angeles and San Francisco. And both the Los Angeles and San Francisco branches have kind of sub-branches. So for Los Angeles, there's also a branch in Long Beach. We just, actually 2 days ago, what's today? No, last week, we had a candidate running for mayor of Long Beach. And there was no other candidate except the incumbent and us. And so, and they were running as a socialist candidate. She was running, Stevie Marino. And the media there was predicting that she wouldn't even get 1% of the vote because she was running as a socialist. She actually got 16.5% of the vote, which we thought was good. I mean, people voted, you know, because they don't like the incumbent and so forth. But a lot of people knew that they were running for a socialist there. And also in Riverside, California, out in the Inland Empire, as they call it. And in San Francisco, we have groups in Santa Cruz and San Jose and Sacramento, in addition to Berkeley and San Francisco in the more immediate Bay Area. We also have smaller branches in Seattle, in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in Miami, Pittsburgh, Boston, New Haven, Connecticut, New Paltz and Syracuse, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Austin, Texas, and our latest, where we just have opened up offices in Albuquerque. So it's very interesting what's happening. And what's particularly interesting to us, well, last night I was watching, just because I was in Utah and I was in a motel room, I watched a large part of the 180th convention of the LDS Church. And our leadership does not look like that leadership. I would probably could fit in with that leadership. It was like all these middle-aged and older white guys, one after another, after another, after another. It's kind of like, wow. They're not thinking that much about diversity, I guess. But the main recruiting that our party has done, and we've consciously tried to do this, is among young people. And to build a multinational party inside the United States, which we view as a multinational country. of the country of different nationalities. We considered, in order to create a unified working class struggle, that it's absolutely necessary to do that. For that organization must also have in its leadership and membership that kind of diversity. And of course, we also pay a lot of attention to the issue of women's oppression and the issue of lesbian, gay, bi, and trans oppression, and consider those also to be integral to building the party. We just had, in February, our first party congress, which we regard as a higher step, a higher form of organization, meaning that we have a delegated meeting instead of all the people coming together. We have a delegated meeting based on the number of people in the different branches around the country. We adopted, and this will be published very soon, an official party program and a constitution. And these are things that we also regard as necessary and as a step forward. We are involved in many, many struggles. One of the reasons that I brought a lot of literature that's very California specific for the most part, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the things that we're involved in. So we're, right now, we just came off of March 20th, and March 20th was the 7th anniversary of the Iraq War. The PSL is one of the central organizations in the ANSWER Coalition. ANSWER stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. It's organized almost all of the big anti-war demonstrations over the last 8 or 9 years in Washington, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, and some other cities. And on March 20th, about 5,000 people marched in San Francisco. It wasn't like the period of a few years ago when hundreds of thousands of people were demonstrating, but it was an excellent demonstration, we thought. And one of the highlights of it, and this I think gives you an idea of what we're trying to do in practice, is, it's very easy to talk about that the different issues and struggles should find unity together. The harder part is actually doing that. And our idea is that you can accomplish that. The best way to accomplish that is in action. So one of the things that's going on in San Francisco is I would say the most important union in San Francisco today, or at least one of the most important unions. I shouldn't say the most important because it depends on what's happening. But the Hotel Workers Union there, Local 2, has about 9,000 members. Most of the members of the union are immigrants. Most of the hotel workers are immigrants, with very, very large numbers being Chinese and Latino workers. And they're in a big battle with the transnational hotels. And even though these hotels have still been making money, these workers maybe make $12 or $13 an hour, which sounds better here than it does in San Francisco with its high cost of living. But they have fully paid health care. Making $12 or $13 an hour is barely getting by in San Francisco. But you can do it and you can live if your health care is paid. So what the hotels are trying to do is make them pay $250 or $300 a month, which they can't do. They really, so there's a big battle. And we participate with the Local 2 in they call strikes, they call sporadic strikes, and civil disobedience actions and picket lines and so forth. And we always participate with them. But what we did this time on March 20th is we took the whole anti-war demonstration to one of the hotels. So we took 5,000 people marched to the Hilton Hotel, which is one of the hotels being boycotted. And the hotel workers had about 100 workers and organizers out there. So it was a way for many of the people who came to the demonstration, for them, and in particular a lot of the really young people, like people who are in high school, they don't know anything about unions these days. That's gone out of the consciousness of so many people. And it was like, by actually being there and chanting, boycott the Hilton, is a way, that you start thinking about this in a different way than if you just read about it or somebody said something to you about it and so forth. And of course, for the hotel workers, they're seeing, here comes the anti-war movement, and the anti-war movement is with them in their struggle. So we're involved in that. We're involved in a big struggle with about MUNI, which in San Francisco is the bus system. San Francisco's bus system carries 700,000 people a day, 700,000 rides a day, which is about equal to the population of San Francisco. But the city, because all the cities and states in the country are suffering, these very, very severe cutbacks now. They're trying to really cut the bus service. And the media, the capitalist media in San Francisco, has been focusing its attack on the bus drivers as they're the problem because they get paid too much. which is really ridiculous. I mean, driving a bus in San Francisco is not an easy job, I can guarantee you. And a lot of times they're driving the articulated buses, which is really 2 buses. And also, the union is a predominantly black union. It's one of the 2 in San Francisco. The longshore dock workers are predominantly African-American union, and so are the bus drivers. So, you know, attacking them fits in with, you know, other agendas as well. So we're in the midst of a big struggle, and they also had a delegation in the anti-war demonstration, and they spoke from the stage, gave a very militant speech, you know, and really about the uniting of these different issues and struggles. And also, we're working with other community organizations in doing this. And these are kind of all things that are happening almost at the same time. And May 1st is coming up. On May 1st, there's a coalition that's formed. We helped to form the coalition. And it's going to be a day of International Workers' Day, also Immigrant Rights Day, and also a day saying, you know, no cutbacks, money for people's needs, not for war. So there's going to be a march from the Mission District, which is where we have a pretty large office there. And it's the main Latino district of the city, going down to the City Hall. And then we have people who are in the different unions, like the Sign and Display Union. Gloria La Riva, I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she's the president of the Typographical Union, which has been under big attack. She's also the national coordinator of the Committee to Free the Cuban Five that Greg was talking about just before the meeting started. And then there is the Cuban Five case itself. And the Cuban Five case is a case that it also shares the same office. It's the national office there. And you know, right now, there's the Obama administration is actually stepping up the offensive against Cuba. Because of the world economic crisis, and because there is not a socialist camp or socialist bloc in the world anymore since the fall of the Soviet Union 20 years ago, it made Cuba, which didn't have to think about this back then, you know, it integrated Cuba to a certain extent into the world capitalist market, or made it influenced much more by the world capitalist market, although it retains a very socialized economy. So it's, you know, and all of the countries, the economic crisis is particularly hitting the poorer countries even much harder than it is the advanced capitalist countries. And then we also have the election campaigns going on. And you can see the flyers for this. In California, we're running candidates for governor and secretary of state. And also Gloria is running against Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House, of course, and is from San Francisco. And it expresses, I think, all of these different struggles. Like our understanding, we are a Marxist party. We are also a Leninist party. But we do not describe ourselves as Marxist-Leninist, which might sound like a small technicality. But in the world today, when people identify themselves as Marxist-Leninist, it usually means they support Stalin. Their supporters of Stalin, that they have a Stalinist view or, you know, sympathetic to Stalin. Well, we're not. We're also not Trotskyists. We're not either one of those. But we do take from Lenin some things that we consider to be extremely important. One of those is that Lenin was very strong on principle. I mean, very, very firm on principle. And I think that it's worth looking at Lenin since he was the leader of the first successful revolution. But he was extremely flexible in tactics. And Lenin it was very interesting. He came from the middle class himself. I mean, the real middle class. But he immersed himself in understanding the working class and the peasants, who were the great majority in society at that time. And throughout his whole time leading up to the revolution, whenever there was an organization that involved workers, even if it was a religious organization, like in the 1905 revolution, there was the priest who led an organization. Lenin was very interested in that organization and very interested in speaking to workers in the language that workers could respond to. And also that to be able to see where the struggle was and go to where the struggle was. But to be able to be in all these different arenas of struggle. Lenin is very interesting, and a lot of times Lenin is taken wrongly, I would say, because people, when they're polemicizing or arguing with each other, different Marxist groups, they'll invoke Lenin and they'll quote Lenin, one part of Lenin, but if you only look at one part of Lenin, you don't really understand Lenin. Like Lenin wrote things that sound exactly the opposite at different times of what he said at an earlier time. Because he believed that there had to be a great flexibility in tactics according to the time. So I don't know how much you know about Lenin, or you've talked about Lenin, but like for instance, the big struggle that caused the split in 1902 and 1903 in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party between the Bolsheviks, which he led, and the Mensheviks, was over Lenin's insistence that you couldn't just be a supporter of the party, you had to take responsibility for work. You had to be involved in work. And he said, we want a party of professional revolutionaries. He didn't mean just people who worked full-time for the party, because obviously everybody can't do that, but people who were that dedicated and that they would undertake work and not just be, like in a lot of the socialist parties at that time, including the one here that was pretty big, a lot of times the leaders were people, they would be ministers or they would be, something else, and they would come and they would give the speeches on Saturday. And then the other people who worked in the office and did all the work and created the leaflets and handed out the leaflets and went to the picket lines, that wouldn't be the leaders. And Lenin rejected that idea altogether of a party. He said, we have to have a party that the leadership is not some elevated position. Leadership is a division of labor. And everybody has to work in the party. So that's one thing. Another thing about Lenin that I think is interesting, in that I can say this about ourselves, and I remember when I first became an activist in the time of the Vietnam War, in the late 60s and early 70s, especially in the late 60s, there was always a great frustration that we were talking, some of us earlier today, we were having lunch about the romanticization of the 60s, like things just, the idea you go, things just kind of barreled forward, which wasn't true. There would be these massive demonstrations and sometimes huge numbers of people would get arrested, and then you'd go back to your city, and that would happen in Washington or New York, and then you'd go back to your city or town and you'd say, well, what the hell do we do now? And that was kind of like people were constantly tormented by that. And also tormented by the fact, and I think this is one of the things that gets to activists more than almost anything else, is how come people don't respond more to our message? How can we make people respond more? Which is actually an impossibility. And so you can get over the frustration in a way by realizing you can't make people interested in something. It's actually impossible. They become interested, but I'll say a little bit more about that. But the idea that what do you do? What do you really do in relation to this struggle? What do we do as conscious people? Because the people in this room are all conscious people. We have consciousness. And what we want to do is see a mass movement, because we understand that without a mass movement, there can't be revolution. And without revolution, without a change, without an end to this power of the capitalist class, we cannot really address any of the fundamental issues in society. We can't talk about the environment. We can't really deal with the environment. I mean, that's a big pressing issue. As long as profit remains the driving force of society, and of those who, it's the driving force of society as long as the capitalist class is the ruling class. As long as they are the ruling class and they are making the decisions about what to produce and what not to produce, and they control the resources, then it's impossible. We should fight for the reforms, but it's impossible to actually solve that issue or any other issue. And that goes for racism, or it goes for sexism, and it goes for the cutbacks that are happening, and the cost of education, and the healthcare crisis. I believe that one of the things the healthcare crisis proves, and even the healthcare, the so-called resolution to it, the healthcare bill, is something that I've actually thought for a long time, is that most of the time when people are progressive people think, well, we'll have healthcare reform on the way to revolution. I believe we'll have real healthcare reform after we have a revolution. That it'd be easier to have a revolution than it will be under this system to actually change the healthcare system. It's so bad, and it's so profit-driven. So in order to get to where we have to go, we can only get there through a mass movement, a mass workers' movement. That also brings in other parts of society. But the working class in the United States is enormous. I mean, this is one of the things that there's a conscious campaign to hide from the people. that, you know, the idea that we're all the middle class. And even the unions do this too. They put out flyers and, you know, I see them and they say, let's work together to rebuild the middle class. You're not the middle class. You're the working class. Everybody who has to sell their labor, their ability to work in order to live, who doesn't own their own means of production, is the working class. Is part of the working class. But you know, I mean, the whole thing of Labor Day being in September and the middle class propaganda, that's all to make people here, to make workers here, believe that there's something different than what they really are. And also that they're separate from the workers in other countries. And of course, that's part of our battle. But how a mass movement comes into being, we don't control that. The conscious people don't control that. And this is one of the things that won me over when I was young to the idea of a revolutionary party. This was Lenin's view too. And others picked it up, of course. But if you look at the last several years, just to take an example, in the run-up to the Iraq War, I was very involved in all this. It was in the summer of 2002. We had formed the Answer Coalition right after September 11th, like 2 days after September 11th. We formed the Answer Coalition, several organizations, because we could see what was coming. We had many of us had been working on the issue of Iraq and the sanctions. We knew that the Bush administration wanted to go to war with Iraq. We knew the war was going to come, so we started organizing right away. First, the war was in Afghanistan. And then in the summer of 2002, it was around late July, we could see the war, they're going to go to war against Iraq. The signs are there. So we were working at that time with the longshore workers who were locked out, the dock workers who have a great history in the Bay Area. And we had a joint demonstration with them on September 14th, 2002, against war and in support of the workers, and about 1,500 people came to the demonstration. 2 weeks later, there was another demonstration. It was on the second anniversary of the Palestinian Intifada, which had started on September 28th, 2000. This was 2 years later. And about 4,000 or 5,000 people came. A week later, there were demonstrations around the country by another organization. It was called Not in Our Name, which isn't around anymore. And about 10,000 people came in San Francisco. And then we had called, when we saw that the war was coming, back at the end of July, early August, we had set October 26, 2002, as a date for mass demonstrations in San Francisco and Washington. And on that day, 100,000 people came out in San Francisco and 200,000 people came in Washington. So what had happened, and if you look at that period of time, in 6 weeks, we had gone from 1,500 people to 100,000 people in San Francisco. And I was joking with people, well, we could claim that our leafleting skills had really improved over that period of time. But of course, that wouldn't exactly been honest. It wasn't what we did that changed the number of people who came out. We don't control that. Also, the people in power don't control it either. The movement has a spontaneous character to it. And what really had happened is that a part of the population became alarmed by what was happening. And they could see the war was coming. About a week before the October, this was the first of the big demonstrations, so a week before that, I saw an ad in the San Francisco Bay Guardian, which is kind of a liberal, progressive weekly there. And it was an ad, it was a small ad for a women's clothing store, and it said, what will you be wearing to the protest this fall? And I said, okay, it's going to be a big demonstration. And why did that store owner put that ad in? Because she heard her customers talking about going to demonstrations. I mean, that's us, store owners are like that, like small owners. They think, okay, what's going to bring people into the store? What's going to bring us business? And the most powerful form of media, I believe, down till today, with all the forms of technological media that have been developed, the most powerful form of media remains word of mouth. When the change happens in the population, when the change in consciousness happens, it happens, I think, like this, is that people start saying to each other, they've seen this stuff, maybe they were interested in it, they never thought of themselves as a protester before, but now something happened and they feel that they have to do something. And so they start talking to their friends and say, I'm going to go to this protest, are you going to go to it? And that process goes on. When that process happens, then there's a mass movement. when that process happens outside of who the already conscious and organized forces are. So then what happened after that, that demonstration happened, less than 3 months later, a week less than 3 months later, in Washington, there was a march of 500,000 people. It was enormous. It was the biggest thing since the Vietnam War. In San Francisco, it was 250,000 people. A month later was February 15th, 2002, which is the big, 2003, which is the 1 month before the war started, the biggest single day of protest in the history of the world. There were probably 40 or 50,000 people who demonstrated on that day, over that weekend. In Spain, there were 4 million people, 4 to 5 million. In Italy, an equal number of people. Just in those two countries, 8 to 10 million people. And the demonstrations were enormous everywhere. And then 2 weeks later, there was another huge demonstration. And 2 weeks after that, another one. And a week after that, another one. And so there was this very intense period. And then Iraq was conquered and the movement fell off. So if you go ahead, that was 2003. 2006, I mean, I'm saying this because we should have a little overview of what period are we living in right now? What's really going on right now? 2006. I remember sitting in our office in San Francisco. It was a Friday evening. We were about to have a meeting. And on the Yahoo News, this headline came up and it said, 100,000 people march for immigrant rights in Chicago. And my reaction to that was that it was a typographical error. And that they had added at least one extra zero to this number because there were no marches happening. And it turned out that the headline was wrong. There were really 300,000 to 500,000 people who had marched in Chicago that day. 2 weeks later, on March 25th, I went to Los Angeles. We went down to Los Angeles. That was the biggest demonstration I have ever seen in my life. We went at 8:30. By 9 o'clock, we had several hundred signs. They were all gone. We had probably 5,000 or 7,000 flyers. All of them were gone by 9 in half an hour. The march was supposed to gather at 10 a.m. and march at noon, and it started marching at 9. And for the next 5.5 hours, it marched on not one street, but 3 parallel streets to the Los Angeles City Hall, and it went from 9 in the morning till 2:30 in the afternoon. Non-stop, I mean, like, unbelievable. Was it 1 million people or 2 million people? I couldn't really say. It was at least 1 million people. And then May Day came only 6 weeks after that, 5 weeks after that. And May Day of 2006. And on May Day 2006, the newspaper said over 1 million people demonstrated in the city, but if you actually read the article, like the New York Times, you could put together the numbers and see that even by their numbers, it was 3 or 4 million people had marched. And an equal number of people had not gone to work that day, had struck on May Day. And it restored May Day. It restored May Day as a day in the United States. It was the immigrant workers who did it. And it's interesting because it was also the immigrant workers, except they were German then, in 1886, who were the ones who were responsible for the first May Day. But what had caused that enormous change to happen? I mean, so quickly. If you had told anybody, including, and I know people who were the most involved people in the immigrant rights movement for the last 25 to 30 years, if you had told them on March 9th of 2006, if you had told anybody, you know, I think this year on May Day, millions of workers will march and millions of more workers will strike, and May Day will be revived as International Workers' Day in the United States, you would have gotten very few takers on that one. And again, it wasn't the actual work of the organizers that did it. It was the fact that there was a bill that started to be talked about first on Spanish radio stations and then among the people on the job all over the place in predominantly immigrant communities, mostly Latino, but like in Chicago it was also the Polish communities and the Chinese communities. And what it was about the Sensenbrenner bill. And the Sensenbrenner bill, introduced by this very rich capitalist guy who's one of the heirs to, what's the fortune? It's one of the big, you know, home products things. I'll remember the name. But anyways, he put in this bill that would make it a felony to be in the United States illegal. So all the people were saying, they were saying to each other, you know, here we are. We're the people who work in construction. We build the houses. We harvest the food. We take care of the children. And now we're going to be called felons because we don't have documents. And that became the sentiment, the thing that, boom. So, and there's been more. There was what happened after Proposition 8 was passed in California. These spontaneous, so if you look really at the last 7 years, just the last 7 or 8 years, we've seen repeated outbursts of very large numbers of people where hundreds of thousands or millions of people have come out. So is my point that organization is not important because we can't create the numbers of people? No, my point is that happens spontaneously, but what we can do, and this was Lenin's central idea, is that when that happens, those movements can either be sustained or carry on, or they can, like the immigrant rights movement, rise very quickly and decline very quickly in terms of the number of people participating. 3 weeks after May 1st, there was another demonstration for immigrant rights in San Francisco, and there were a couple hundred people who came. So what sustains them is the organization, is having organization in place. When the mass upsurge comes, like these kinds I'm talking about, or the bigger mass upsurge, which can actually lead to a revolutionary crisis in society, without which you can't have a revolution, without a revolutionary crisis. The big question will be, is there the kind of organization there, the organization in place, that can help to lead those movements, not just to a big demonstration, but to a revolutionary victory? Can you convert the revolutionary opportunity into revolutionary victory? We have way too many examples of the negative. I mean, Chile in 1973, what happened in Argentina a couple years later, what happened in Spain in the 1930s, or in France at that time, or in Indonesia in 1965. And when the revolutionary opportunity comes, when a revolutionary crisis comes in society, the ruling class becomes terrified by it, and then turns to, like Nazi Germany is another, what happened in Germany in the early 30s is another example. The ruling class will turn then to the most violent forms of repression against the workers if they have been scared by the workers. Right now they're not scared by the workers, but the time will come when they will be. And so the idea of being prepared for a revolutionary crisis in society and having built organization that can help to transform the revolutionary opportunity into revolutionary victory becomes, from our point of view, a question of life and death for the working class. And when revolutionary opportunities come, they may not come again for another half century or century. That's not something that comes along. So I would just want to close by saying this. One, I'm very glad that you are here and that you exist, and I wish you well. I hope that you can expand and to grow, because there is really a lack of revolutionary organizations right now. There's not nearly enough as there should be. Number two, I hope that we can find ways to work together, and I think that that's very important. And we don't have to agree on every single issue, but I think that we do have a lot of commonality just from hearing a little bit of what you all have been saying here today. Number three, that we are having in Los Angeles a national public conference on November 13th and 14th. The last one we had was at the end of 2008, it was at UCLA, and it was about 400 to 500 people who attended. We think more people will come. This one will be at the University of Southern California, which is in the more center part of Los Angeles, and we wanted to get a more central location. But I hope you'll think about it between now and then. There's a little bit of time of sending a representative or sending people there, having a solidarity message at it, and something like that. The last thing I want to say is that the big thing I think that the biggest things that stand in the way of people taking action in here is that people feel powerless. They feel like they can't make a change. And there's a million ways people are encouraged to feel that way. By the politicians, by the media, that, we don't know anything, we have to leave it to the people who really do know, even though, they are really our complete enemies. But there's that feeling that, and even for many people who are politically conscious, the question, can there really be a revolution in the United States? Is that really possible? Is socialism possible in the United States? And I think if you look at all of the contradictions and problems of society that exist in society and that are multiplying and intensifying now, I don't think there's any other way out. But I remember I was active in the anti-apartheid movement for many, many years. And you could see how horrific the apartheid system was in South Africa. And but you wondered, would it ever really end? With all. But then it did end. And afterwards, one of the leaders of the African National Congress there, right after it said, in the speech, he said, "Every revolution is impossible until it happens, and then it was always inevitable." And I think that's true. That when you look back in retrospect, you can see how the contradictions were such that there was no other way out. But it's hard to believe it until it actually comes. It's hard to see beyond what the society and the situation in which we actually live. So, thank you very much.
All right. Sorry, there's a running joke, Zizek makes it, right? You see these old videos of Mussolini and Hitler, right? They just do this, right? They don't clap for themselves. You see Stalin, though, he's clapping for himself, right? The difference, because he's doing it with the people, right? He helped the people, right? The fascists just take it.
Yes.
We're very keen on that. But.
Okay, so why don't people make comments and... yeah.
So I'm thinking of what is to be done. Lenin has this problem. Sorry?
Do you want me to move the camera?
Sorry. Either way, you can pull it back. That's perfect. So Lenin has this problem, right? He basically like, okay, so what's happening? Right? There's all these mass uprisings. And he says what the party has a problem with is divvying out tasks, right? Having work for them to do.
Right.
But you see this is a sort of problem with all these upsurges of spontaneous movements is what is the work that needs to be done, like with this harnessing and channeling this energy.
Right, and that's why you have to build up, why it's so important. Once there's a real upsurge that's happening, then the organizations are always behind. They're always trying to catch up with the movement. And that's especially true when there's a revolution. Because what happens in a revolution, and like a mass upsurge of people, like the ones I was mentioning, like the immigrant rights or the anti-war, when there was a huge upsurge, they're sort of like mini revolutions. Like all this energy is unleashed. It's like unbelievable, the energy that comes out. And the people are there and saying, what can I do? What can I do? Like in What Is to Be Done, Lenin talks about how if the party was better, the big problem in his view of the time of the Russian socialist movement was, and the party, was that the party wasn't well enough organized to take advantage of what all people wanted to do to help the party. And he says that he said, so many more people, if we were more tightly organized, because, of course, it was a little bit different, but not qualitatively different. The difference was that at the time, if you did anything under Tsarist Russia, you were subject to great repression. Well, a lot of people feel that way now. And if they're going to go do something, they want to feel that they're doing something that matters. I mean, one of the big things is, like for us, we have quite a dynamic office, and we've had quite a lot of experience, but we still have this problem all the time. We always have to think about it. If somebody comes and knocks on your door and says, I want to help, what can you have them do? So you have to have that. Like we have volunteer coordinators, we have lists of tasks, things that you can plug people into. But then you have to kind of quickly know if, this is somebody who wants to not just do, something an hour a week or something like this. This is somebody who wants to become an organizer. And how can you help them become an organizer? And it's a really critical issue because if you can't, then they'll probably go away. And they'll probably go on to something else, or somebody else, whatever. But it's it's the art and science of revolution, and the art of organization is a large part of what it is. It's art. It's like, being able to sense things about what's going on. But Lenin said that in What Is to Be Done. So I didn't really complete the point I was making when I was talking about how the different sides of Lenin. One side was Lenin in 1903, when the Bolshevik Party was formed, saying we must have a much tighter organization. 2 years later, there's the revolution in 1905, and suddenly, there's like tens of thousands of workers who want to join a revolutionary party. I mean, it was a very unusual development. So Lenin then gets into a huge battle with the rest of the Bolshevik Party, who in the meetings are actually hissing at him and yelling at him and quoting Lenin to Lenin, saying, this is what you said, because what he was saying then was that we should just open the doors of the party and bring them all in. Everybody who wants to join should join the party now. And so they're saying, 18 months ago you said this, and now you're saying, So he was much more nimble, because what he was saying, if they don't join our party, we're the Revolutionary Party, if they don't join our party, they'll join another party. They want to join a workers' party right now, and so they can either join the Reformist Party, and we'll lose them to reformism, or they can join a revolutionary party if we open the doors, and some of them will stay and some of them won't stay, but let's deal with the issue. Let's bring them into the party first, and then we'll deal with those problems afterwards. And then, you have Lenin saying, denouncing the elections at one time, boycott the elections, and then a year later saying, okay, now the situation has changed, and we have lost ground, and we have to use the elections to reach out to the workers in whatever way we can, even under the most disadvantageous conditions that are imposed upon us by the Tsarist government. So like, we're running people, we ran first in 2008, we're running people in California. Not only do we not expect to get a lot of, we want to get as many votes as possible, but we say to people, when our speakers speak, we say, we don't want to reinforce illusions about elections. So we say to them, we're not running because we're trying to win, and we're not running because we think elections can bring about the change that's needed. We're running to get a message out about the need for socialism, and that what really will bring about the change is not the ballot box, but it'll be the mass movement of the people, and of the working people, the workers in particular, that'll bring about change. Yeah.
It might just be that it wasn't fully developed, but you mentioned something that, at least for me, I'm incredibly critical of. You mentioned that there's nothing you can do, essentially, to raise the consciousness of the people as an organizer. That there's sort of like a mass movement that kind of happens because of material conditions. But I mean, to a certain extent, not to be overly dogmatic, I'm only quoting Lenin because I think Lenin is right in this respect. Going again back to what is to be done, doesn't that very presupposition of a professional revolutionary entail that it's not just the objective forces of this outrage or that outrage, but as a matter of fact, we need the subjective forces of a revolutionary party always intervening, always trying to raise consciousness. And of course, the quintessential example for Lenin is, a worker who is so good at subjectively organizing that they organize their own factory shouldn't be working 16 hours a day. They should be part of the revolutionary vanguard, of the revolutionary party, organizing full time. I mean,
yes, yeah. That is a little bit of a misunderstanding. I'm really glad that you brought it up, because what I was saying was that we can't create the mass movement. But that doesn't mean we don't have an extremely, even in the time, every single day, all across this country, there are people who are waking up and they're disillusioned with what's going on. And what we do now is extremely important. When I mean building up an organization, I mean recruiting more people, having a greater division of labor, having more specialization within the organization, doing everything that you need to do to build that organization. But most importantly, it means bringing in. You can't do that, any of those things, unless you can recruit and bring in more people. And every day, the people who are waking up disillusioned with what's going on, they are being offered, mostly not a revolutionary socialist answer to why they're disillusioned. What they're getting instead is they're getting the Tea Party. They're getting religious answers to it that say, and the religious answers, which is don't think about what's going on here on earth. Your reward, if you are faithful, will come in the next life. There's a lot of that. I mean, that's very popular all over the place. And there's also, even more fascist answers. The problem is the immigrants, the problem is people of color, the problem is gay people. I mean, all of these things are brought up and are offered to people as explanations for why they are having the problems that they're having. And every other answer is to pit you against somebody else or to have you withdraw altogether from the world. And our message, which is to say, we as working people should look beyond the differences that have been driven, pounded into our brains, and they have been. I mean, if you watch like primetime TV ever, almost all the humor revolves around making fun of somebody or the differences between people. You know, there's so much, I mean, it's constantly, and to say to people, you know, we have a commonality of interest and a commonality of problems, while at the same time recognizing that there are special oppressions, which, you know, we have to take into account in the United States. But, so I completely agree with you, I completely agree with Leonard about that. That has to be, that's the ongoing process. My point was, we cannot go out, no matter, if we went out tomorrow and we gave out 50,000 flyers here, we wouldn't necessarily have 1,000 people come to a demonstration, or maybe not even 50. You know, that's not under our control. What is under our control is building up organization. And in building the organization also means a lot of different things. Like I started out talking about this demonstration in San Francisco. We should think all the time, like, how can we build solidarity between people? You know, how can we make, you know, how can we, and it's action that really does it. Without action, there's nothing. You know, I mean, without action, all the discussion you know, really boils down to how many angels fit on the head of a pin. You know, no matter, you know, how you put it. Yeah.
What would you say to a teacher here who is afraid of unionizing at the expense of getting fired?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to argue with people about that because, and also, I mean, particularly under the conditions that exist now, and the way the whole system has been transformed, so that in most colleges, and I don't know about this one, but most colleges, the majority of faculty members now are adjuncts. The adjunct system is really a disgusting system. In a lot of places, people are teaching at 3 or 4 different colleges, and they're driving, you know, 800 miles a week to be able to like try to piece together a living. So it's hard to say to them, "Oh, don't worry, you know, it'll be okay." I mean, and generally people who tell you that they're afraid to do it because they're afraid of losing their job, they're not going to do it. The honest, you know, it's kind of like you have to. It has to be the people who already know that and they say, "I don't care, I'm going to do it." But if people tell you, you know, I mean, you encounter a lot of people when you do outreach, and I'm sure that all of you have. But you know, you go through all these experiences of talking to people, and you know, you can argue with people, but at a certain point you realize, okay, I could maybe argue with this person and I could win them over, or I could argue with this person for the next year and a half, and they're not, you know, this isn't going to get me anywhere, and maybe I should be talking to somebody else. But I kind of think that's where you, and you have to figure that out. It's not like there's not some, you know, table set up or something like that that tells you yes or no.
Gotcha.
If you don't mind, could you go into the various really existing socialist countries, the previously existing socialist countries, and the various anti-imperialist struggles
Right.
that the PSL either supports or doesn't support?
Well, I would say this, is that there's no country that has fully achieved socialism in the world up until today. Because none have had the opportunity. The full achievement of socialism would be marked, in our opinion, by a relative abundance in society. And I don't mean abundance like you know, like 43 different kinds of cereal and 123 kinds of you know, toothpaste and so forth. I mean, those are not really necessities of life. That's like such a waste. But I mean, that where the society was passing out of, there was no more poverty. Where there was housing for people, there was food for everyone, there was health care for people, there were jobs, you know. And also that there was the beginning of the withering away of the state. And so I don't think that can actually happen if we understand the state to be a repressive apparatus against one class or another, including in a worker state. Cuba has a state. It has an army. It has a militia, which involves a huge part of the population. Over 1 million people, I think, are in the militia. And it has police, and it has prisons, and so forth. And it represses the capitalists or those who collaborate with the United States and are counter-revolutionaries. So I don't think it's really possible to have full socialism until probably until imperialism is eliminated in the world, and then you can move on. But in the popular language of socialism, where there's socialized economy, The first country that succeeded in doing that was the Soviet Union, and not without a huge number of problems, internal problems as well as external problems, but it had a socialized economy, and it showed, one of the things the Soviet Union showed was the incredible potential, the dynamism of a centralized economy, of a socialized economy. The Soviet Union went from being the poorest of the big countries in Europe in 1917, and then it suffered huge devastation over the next few years in the Civil War. But by the 1960s, it was the second largest economy in the world. And it had gone through, in addition to all it had gone through during the revolutionary period, it had undergone unbelievable destruction at the hands of the Nazis. 27 million people killed, 2/3 of the production destroyed in the country. And yet, and even though it had to have a powerful military after the war, because they knew the United States would attack them otherwise, and would launch atomic war against them, which came very, very close in the late 40s and early 50s, as well as the early 60s. They were able to build tremendously. So with all of its problems and contradictions, we supported the Soviet Union. We supported the other countries in Eastern Europe. That would have been Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, when it still was one country, Romania, Bulgaria, and also Yugoslavia, which had its own differences with that bloc. Also China, after the Chinese Revolution of '49, and Mongolia, which had a socialized economy, even though it was mostly still a nomadic country after the Russian Revolution. Vietnam and Laos, the Cuba, North Korea. We supported the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen when it existed. It used to be South Yemen. And it was a very, very poor country that was trying to build, and it was destroyed by intervention and war. And also Ethiopia was trying to for a period of time as well. Today we support, we don't believe that China has capitalism restored. There's a very interesting thing that I just read. It's a very, very interesting document. It was written by a guy who was in the International Marxist Tendency. I don't know if you're familiar with that. In some places it's called Workers' International League. But you can find him, and his name is very distinctive, so it's really easy to find. His name is Jay Khoo, Khoo. He's not Chinese, but I think he lives in New Zealand. But he's been following China for a long time. He wrote this very interesting document as a response to, and I think he's out of that group now, because they had written a thing called China's Long March to Capitalism. And certainly there's a lot of capitalism in China. But his argument with them is that they don't understand what's really happening in China. We don't support China China doesn't have an internationalist foreign policy. It really doesn't. But we don't also believe that, the Chinese government can do things that the United States government can't do. Like they can say, okay, we're having this new policy and all the companies have to follow the policy. In the United States, the companies say what they want the government to do. And there's not kind of, so we don't consider any of them fully socialist. Vietnam has a largely market economy, has a communist party in power. It's not a completely capitalist country either. North Korea has a million problems. It has a socialized economy, and Cuba does too. But beyond them, and whether or not they were socialist or not, our understanding of the world is see you later. Is based on looking first and foremost at what is the United States trying to do? What is U.S. imperialism trying to do? It's really important to look at to understand what the U.S. global strategy is and why they target certain countries. I think any time any of us who are conscious, socialist, progressive people hear the government of the United States start talking about human rights violations anywhere in the world, a little light should go on. Bing! Why are they talking about that? Did they wake up this morning feeling like, about, some poor people somewhere while yesterday they were bombing the hell out of them and destroying their country, but today they're concerned about human rights? It's never true. It's never the reason when they put that forward. I was talking earlier today about Iran. They're really concerned about election violations in Iran or the rights of women in Iran. Or let's take a little trip across the Persian Arabian Gulf to Saudi Arabia. where you don't have to worry about election violations because there are no elections, and where women have no rights at all. But because the ruling class of that country, that's a junior partner of imperialism, does what the oil companies and the banks want, you don't read much about that in the media, but every day you hear about Iran. So sometimes people would say, like about Iraq, when the 2 Iraq wars were happening, especially the second one, they said, we were supporters of Saddam Hussein. Well, we weren't really supporters of Saddam Hussein. We understand the Ba'ath Party. We understood its character. We understood that it was an anti-communist party that also called itself socialist. But we defend Iraq's right to exist as an independent country. The U.S. didn't have any problem with Saddam Hussein. They weren't upset about Saddam Hussein when Saddam Hussein was allied with the United States. But like a lot of other leaders, whether it was Noriega in Panama, or Saddam Hussein, or Ahmadinejad in Iran today, it's when those leaders won't kneel before Washington. Even if they've had relationships before, like Saddam Hussein did and Noriega in Panama. They had long relationships with imperialism, but then when they wouldn't completely capitulate, then they become targeted and so forth. So we defend them as oppressed countries, and that goes for most of the countries that have adopted a socialist system, or that have socialized economies. They come from their struggle to be able to develop socialism, or some variant of socialism, is also completely connected with their struggle to have self-determination as countries. They're all countries that were colonized, they were neo-colonies before. And we defend their right to independence, unconditionally. Unconditionally, and that is hard for people to understand. When the first Gulf War happened, and some of the same people who organized the Answer Coalition were the key people in organizing what was then called the National Emergency Committee, the National Coalition Against U.S. Intervention in the Middle East. There was a big split in the anti-war movement. Then there was another big split in 2003 in the anti-war movement, and there probably always will be as long as imperialism exists, because there's the loyal opposition and the disloyal opposition. And that's how I would term them. The people I'm calling loyal opposition might object to that. But I think that what they were saying in the first Gulf War was, okay, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and we have to condemn Iraq for doing that. We have to condemn Saddam Hussein, and we have to support sanctions, not war. And we said, well, we don't agree with any of those things. It's not up to, Kuwait is not the part of the United States. And there was a long historical debate between, Kuwait was part of Iraq, and it was cut out of Iraq in 1922 when the British took over the region. Everybody in Iraq, I've been to Iraq a couple times, everybody you talk to, whether they're Kurdish or Shia or Sunni Arab, they all agree Kuwait's part of Iraq. That wasn't a minority view or just Saddam Hussein's opinion. So we're not, what are we send 500,000 troops halfway around the world because Iraq took over Kuwait? Is that really a dispute for the United States? And also, by the way, sanctions are really a form of economic warfare. And we did a lot on this issue in the 1990s and early 2000s, but about the genocidal impact on Iraq of the sanctions. And so the people on the other side who were arguing with us in the anti-war movement about this, and who were saying, you have to condemn Saddam Hussein, and you have to say sanctions, not war, because otherwise in Congress, the people who are against the war won't even talk to us because they have to say that in order to have any legitimacy inside of what's the acceptable society, acceptable polity of the United States. So we said, yeah, well, they're not going to stop the war either. But this idea of how you orient people is the idea of saying sanctions, not war, or we have to condemn Iraq, is like grows out of the sentiment that so many people are inculcated with in the United States that if something happens somewhere in the world, that we have to do something, right? You hear people, all the time I have the debates with people, they say, finally, well, if the sanctions weren't good and you're against the war, didn't we have to do something? Well, then you have to break down that question. First of all, what do you mean by we? And because we that's a really important starting point for people. Are we the United States of America? Or are we, the working class of the United States of America, and is there a ruling class that is also not only the enemy of the people around the world, but they're our enemy too. So what do you mean by we? And because really we, in that context, always ends up meaning you have to support something that the imperialist government is undertaking somewhere in the world. So I think, and that's a good starting point with people, actually. That's a good arguing point. Like, what do you mean by we? And then the next question is, why do we, no matter how you define the we, have to do something? Do you support the idea of the policeman of the world? I mean, but I think that all of those things serve to also show this demarcation line in the movement. And so back then it was called the National Coalition for Peace and Justice or something like that. And this time it was called United for Peace and Justice. The coalitions that organized on the basis that, our main thing is how we can strengthen our representatives, the people who are on our side in Congress. Very few of them are on our side in Congress. Very, very, very few. Is it time to end this meeting?
We could probably take maybe one or two more questions. If anybody has something you'd like to discuss?
Yeah.
I was just curious, since you did indicate at the beginning that you're Marxist and Leninist, but wouldn't be sympathetic to Stalin. What are some of your criticisms of Stalin that would prevent you guys from being sympathetic, like say other parties in the U.S. at the time?
Well, as I said, we considered, if you look back in history, we considered that at every stage, the Soviet Union, no matter what the policy of the leaders was at a particular time, was something to be defended against imperialism. So even when, there were things that the Stalin government was doing or other governments that we very much disagreed with, we still supported the existence of that state against imperialism and against counter-revolution, which eventually came from within. But we thought that the Stalin leadership did a lot of damage, actually, to the international communist movement. In the late 1930s, when, it's a kind of long story, but in the late 20s, once Stalin had established himself in power as the central leader, they took a sharp turn to the left and actually adopted a lot of what Trotsky's program had been for collectivization of industry and agriculture, but did it in a very rough way, very, very rough way. And this was in 1928. And along with that, took a big turn to the left internationally. And all the communist parties, which were quite vigorous, a lot of them were quite vigorous at the time, started saying that the socialist parties and everybody who wasn't done, basically, who was on the left, were social fascists. And one of the things that led to was that the socialists and the communists had a majority of the votes, and they commanded the allegiance of the working class in Germany. But because the communists took this very sectarian position, even to the point where Stalin and the leadership of the German Communist Party in 1932 said, well, if the Nazis come to power, that'll be okay. The socialists are really social fascists anyways. They're socialist in word and fascist in deed, about the socialists. And they had a lot of reason to complain against the socialists. I mean, the socialists had been terrible. The Socialist Party had been the government, done terrible things. But what they needed to do was to win over the base of the Socialist Party to have a common defense against the Nazis. Before the Nazis took power, the Nazis had military organizations. And they would go in and they would attack and kill trade unions in meetings. They would attack Socialist Party meetings. They would attack Communist Party meetings. And those were the two main parties of the working class. And the Communist Party's policy, this ultra-leftist policy, was a disaster. And it was based on the idea that world revolution was coming, that was coming very soon. Stalin was not the kind of thinker that Lenin was, by any means. I mean, he had a lot of talent. He was a major leader, but he didn't have the political understanding by any means that Lenin did. And the idea that you could predict that revolution was going to come in the next 2 years or 4 years, regardless of the economic crisis that was then raging in the world, was not a smart idea. Even when Hitler came to power in 1933, in January 1933, Stalin's position was, and he said that now our turn will come and probably within the next 6 months, and that the communists would be able to take power. Instead, within 6 months, the Communist Party was basically destroyed. The leaders and many of the rank and file cadre were in prison, or in concentration camps right away. They were the first ones who went. And so, and then the socialists and then the unions, and they all got broken up. It was the most powerful left in the world, outside of the Soviet Union, was in Germany. Everyone was counting, everyone in the movement in the world was counting on a revolution in Germany, because now an advanced capitalist country would have a revolution, it would be able to unite with the Soviet Union, and that would greatly help the spread of socialism in the world. Instead, we had this terrible disaster, and where it led to, Germany was probably the most socially advanced country in Europe. There was a big gay rights movement in Germany, ahead of everybody else, and it was making a lot of progress. The women's movement, all these and they were all destroyed. They were all destroyed. And with the approval, and this is part of the hidden history, deliberately distorted history, with the approval and the support of the French, British, and US ruling classes, Germany began to rearm. And they let them rearm. They could have stopped them because under the treaties from World War II or World War I, but they didn't, because what they then began hoping for, and Stalin then quite quickly understood this, was that Germany would go to war against Russia, and Nazi Germany would destroy the Soviet Union, because they were declaring they were going to destroy the Soviet Union. So in 1935, Stalin makes this huge switch, and he goes from saying, revolution, 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 we won't work with anybody, to what was called the United Front Against Fascism, and what is later termed by others as the Popular Front. And the Popular Front was now not only uniting with the socialists, and if you read some of the histories that are written by people who are loyal to Stalin from that period, like there's a book called Black Bolshevik. I don't know if anybody's seen it. Really useful book to read by Harry Haywood. If you can find that book, get that book. It's really worth reading. But there's a very strange part in it where, like, in one chapter, the socialists are social fascists, and in the next chapter, there's a demonstration of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party together, and there's no explanation of how you went from A to B. But inside the Bolshevik Party in the Soviet Union, a large part of the leadership, in fact, everybody in the leadership, understood from the point of view of Lenin and the whole history of the Bolshevik Party that it was impermissible to unite with the bourgeoisie, with even the radical wing of the bourgeoisie in elections and so forth. And now, this is what the Communist Party is. They made this sudden switch in 1935 and started not only uniting with the socialists, but with some of the capitalists, the left-wing capitalist parties, or what they called they were called in many countries the radicals, but they were really pro-capitalist. And they also started, because they wanted to have unity and block with them, and this was in the Spanish Civil War, this was in the elections in France and in many other countries, they had to accept the limits, how far those parties could go in terms of what they were standing for. And so they couldn't call, for instance, in Spain, which was a big issue, of peasant takeovers of the land. The Communist Party began opposing those, the takeover of the factories, because the radical wing of the bourgeoisie could be radical about a lot of things, but they couldn't be radical about taking over bourgeois property. So, and within the party itself, Stalin launched a huge purge of the party, of all the leadership in the party who had grown up in the Bolshevik tradition of rejecting this kind of a political program and regarding it as fatally reformist. And so a large part of the leadership in the purges of 1937 and 38 were wiped out. In fact, by the end of 1938, everybody who had been in the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party at the time that Lenin died was gone, dead or in prison, mostly dead, except for Stalin himself. And that did huge damage to the party inside the Soviet Union. It did huge damage to the tradition of debate and real genuine discussion, without which you cannot build a real party, a workers' party. You can't have just a leader telling everybody what to do, or a couple leaders. There have to be procedures. There has to be room for debate. I mean, at some point, the debate becomes one where people leave the party. But, the thing is, you have to be able, there has to be a constant, ongoing, real, living discussion on everything, because everything that comes along is new. Everything is different. There's no movement that's exactly the same as the movement that came before. And how to relate to them is a constant subject of debate. It must be, otherwise you can't have a living party. And so that became, because the Soviet Union had such great prestige in the world communist movement and in the socialist movements of the world, these kind of practices became adopted by some other countries as well, not all of them. But I think that period, it took a long, very long time afterwards, but I think that it helped also to separate the party from the working class. And that's a fatal, that can be a fatal thing. So we don't agree with Stalin's internal policies in the party, and we did not agree also with what in many cases, like in the late 1930s, were really a policy of appeasement after a period of ultra-leftism, a swing way to the other extreme. And this was one of the things that I think was accurate in Trotsky's criticism of Stalin, was that he referred to Stalin as an impressionistic politician, meaning that he would react to things and like swing, he could swing from one extreme to the other extreme very quickly, very, very different than Lenin, who could adapt to all these situations, but who was very centered in his politics and where we're going. And I think Fidel Castro has been very much like that too, like Lenin, not like Stalin. Like Lenin in being able to have a lot of flexibility, but understanding the core values of the revolution and of socialism that had to be adhered to. So we look at this and you say, you know, we believe that Stalin didn't always do bad things. We think Trotsky made contributions. We think Fidel Castro did, and Ho Chi Minh, and Mao Zedong, and other people, and Che Guevara. But centrally, we still, above all, I would say look to Marx and Lenin.
Well, it's a little past 10. I want to give Richard Becker a hand for coming.